Hey everyone, Warner Wilderness Photography here. Excuse the strange location for today's video. I've been traveling a ton lately, and I actually just got back from an amazing trip to Alaska where we got all of these cool photographs. And in this video, we're going to take this photograph from the trip and take it from this to this. No Photoshop required. We are only going to be using Lightroom for this one. And with that, let's get into it. This photograph was a ton of fun to shoot because it was taken out of a doors-off helicopter ride above a glacier in Alaska. Now, I chose this video because it is a very difficult shooting situation, in which case we are shooting into the sun, but we cannot bracket because we're moving. And also, it has just a ton of contrast, and we are limited with the dynamic range of the camera. So we have some technical hurdles, and I want to cover them in this video. So the first thing we're going to do is trying to recover some of that dynamic range. We're going to try to tone down the contrast of this image. And we can do so first off just by increasing the exposure here, trying to recover some of that. We can go about a stop and a half even. Of course, we're blowing out all of the highlights there, so we can recover that with our highlights slider here, going down a little bit. We can increase the shadows to recover some of that, and we can even take away a little bit of the blacks like so, just trying to recover some of this dynamic range. Now, I could probably take the highlights down a little bit lower, maybe we can go back a little bit on the contrast, something like that. But something that you want to remember whenever you're shooting into the light like this is that you don't want to recover all of those highlights, because doing so you get this weird harsh edge around where the sun is. That's just going to have to be blown out. Shooting a scene like this, I had to make a decision of, how much of the sky I wanted to be blown out. If I were to, properly expose for the sun, you wouldn't be able to see any of the landscape. So rather than have this kind of harsh edge here, which becomes an eye trap or where your eye just gets sucked into it, instead, we want to have a gradual fall off of the highlights or of these clouds into this blown out section. And then later on in this video, we can use masking to try and cover that up and hide this behind a little bit of editing trickery. So in this case, I think we're going to be okay right about there. And then we can go ahead and start in with some of the colors a little bit. Now for this video, or for this photo, I was thinking that I wanted to actually add in a little bit of color grading to this. So if I go down to our color grading, maybe I want to make this a little bit more warm in the highlights. So we can go ahead and go to our highlights and add some warmth to these. Not a whole lot, just a little bit. And then contrastly, I want to cool down the shadows a little bit as well, because we have a lot of warmth in the highlights now. And rather than have the image be too warm, I want to cool down those shadows just a little bit. It's going to be a very subtle adjustment, just like that. You can see before and after, and then maybe I want to saturate those colors a little bit as well. So I could go down here to our color calibration, and I'm just going to use the blue primary channel to saturate those colors just a little bit more. So it's looking good so far. I'm going to add a little bit of contrast into this image using our tone curve adjustment here. So let's go ahead and increase kind of those mid-tones and the highlights, bringing those up a little bit. And then I could bring down those shadows back to where they were before. So we're really just brightening up the midtones and the highlights with this. Now, I think with that being said, we could probably go ahead and get into masking, but I think before that, I am going to need to do a little bit of noise reduction. Zooming in here, we can see that there is a lot of noise because we recovered a ton of darkness or a ton of shadows from this. We increased the main exposure by 1.25 stops. We increased the shadows almost by +50. So we're going, from a ridiculous amount of dark and shadow to a fairly moderately exposed image. So we need to recover some of that, to suppress some of that noise. So we can go in here into our detail. Let's zoom in here so we can really see how it is working. And we're just going to use this click on the denoise, the AI denoise slider, and then is going to take just a few seconds to do its work. And now that that's done, I could say 50% on the denoise. That looks a little bit too plasticky. So then I could just take that and slide it down to, let's go to 0 or 1, and then just slide it up. And I could say maybe somewhere around 25. That looks good. I could also notice though that unfortunately whenever you use the denoise slider or the AI denoise slider, it also resets the color noise reduction. So I'm going to have to bring that back up, and usually I go around 15 to 20, and that is going to get rid of any sort of rainbowy colors that you have in the landscape. So let's zoom on out. And we're going to go back up and we're going to go into our masking panel here. Now, here is the fun part of kind of bringing the photo to life. You know, already we've made a big impact on this, but let's go ahead and try to first tackle this very difficult situation where we're shooting into the sun and we have this blown out portion here. Let's try to tackle that. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. Going to go back to our masking, and I'm going to start off with a radial gradient. And I'm going to make a big radial gradient just like so, right over where we're shooting into the sun, right over that sun, that blown out portion. Take away some of the feathering a little bit. And we are then going to apply a little bit of negative dehaze to this. So we are going to soften that harsh edge with a little bit of negative dehaze and also a little bit of negative clarity here. So just like so. And then again, we can further soften the harsh edge of this by increasing the color temperature of this mask. So just like so. And then let's go ahead and look at the before and the after, the before and the after. And by taking away some of the blacks and by adding in that haze, we soften that edge to where the viewer doesn't necessarily look and think, oh, that's blown out, because it's so gradual. And speaking of shooting into the sun, I'm actually giving a presentation for the Basecamp Photo Club on mastering backlighting on October 7th. There's a link for that down in the description below. I'm going to be covering a ton of topics on mastering backlighting and how to shoot into the light. If you can't join me live on October 7th, don't worry, the whole thing is recorded and you can watch it anytime afterwards. Further looking at this, one of my favorite parts of this photograph is seeing these rays coming through over the mountains here. So let's go ahead and zoom in even further, and we can go ahead and try to emphasize these rays even more, again using masking. Let's create a new mask. This time we're going to use our brush. I'm going to have my feathering maybe at around 30-40%, somewhere in the middle there. I'm going to have the flow at 100. And I'm going to click once right here at the top of the ray, and I'm going to click and hold shift and then click a second time at the bottom of the ray to connect the two like that. I'm going to move over and I have another ray right here. Going to click once, go down to the bottom of the ray, hold down shift and click again. Now this is too much, it's too saturated throughout the whole ray, and of course it's going into the sky. So to clean this up, I can subtract the select sky, and then I'm also going to subtract with a brush, and we're going to have a very feathered out brush with a low flow, and I could then subtract along the top of this to have a more feathered look like it did in real life, or like it did before we started this process. So just like that, going out just like this, just trying to have it soft on the top and more harsh on the bottom. And then again, we're going to subtract with a linear gradient, because if you look here, it has a natural fall off of this kind of haze as it gets to the edge. So we can subtract with a linear gradient from the bottom just like that to have a nice realistic shaft of light coming through there. And we can simply take those blacks and slide that slider up to take away blacks in this photo, or take away blacks in this section. And we can see before and after. Before and after. We're just enhancing those rays that were already there. Zoom on out a little bit. And next, I'm going to do something that I do in most of my photographs, where I use a couple of radial gradients to emphasize a section of the photo. In this case, I want to say the main focal point is right here, the sun, these rays coming out, and of course all of that nice light over there. We have some nice clouds. So we're going to use a radial gradient, a very, very big one, right over the main focal point of the image, just like that. So let's say kind of split the difference, put it right there. You could take away some of that feathering, something like that. And to really emphasize, the eye is drawn to bright things, so we want to make this a little bit brighter. We can increase the exposure just a little bit, maybe take away some of those shadows or just increase the shadows. And then maybe I want to increase the color temperature, the warmth, just a little bit more, just like so. And then I'm going to then do the inverse of this. So I'm going to click on these three dots, duplicate and invert the mask, and then just take that exposure down slightly to, again, really draw our eye right to this point. I think probably the top of this image is maybe a little bit too bright for me still, so I can use a new mask of a linear gradient. And let's kind of bring it down just like that, really feathered out. I don't want it to affect this mountain, so I'm going to hold down the Alt or Option key and intersect this mask with just the sky. And then we can just take that exposure down a little bit to make sure that the top of the image is sort of capped off here. So let's go ahead and do just a little bit of dodging. I don't think we need to do a whole lot in this photo, but let's go ahead and try to emphasize some of the light that's already hitting down here. So I could create a new mask with a brush. Let's take the flow up to around 40%, make sure the feathering is 100, and we can increase the exposure a little bit, maybe increase the whites, and also increase the warmth of this. And then I could just go in and try to further emphasize some of the light it's already hitting in the landscape. I just want to add a little bit more in there. So just like this around here, maybe a little bit on this mountain as well. Just like so. Again, we're hitting the sky though, so we could subtract, select sky, just like that. And then we could see before, after, just adding in that little bit of dodge. Now, I also think that we could probably do a little bit of clarity into this photo. I don't necessarily think the entire image. Let's go ahead and just look. If we go up to our basic panel here, and I slide over the clarity, I kind of like what it's doing in parts of the photo, but not everything. So we could actually do a targeted clarity. I could say, when I'm looking at this, I could say I kind of like what it's doing to the midtones a little bit, or kind of the bottom of the midtones, some of these shadows. So let's go ahead and let's reset that. Can just maybe target with a luminance range over here, and really have this feathered out. I never want to clarify the sky. That never looks good, so I could subtract the sky from that selection. If we still have some of that up there, we could subtract the sky again. Or, I probably don't need it anywhere on these mountains. I could just subtract with, a brush or a luminance, a linear gradient or radial gradient, whatever I need to. And then so we have kind of those lower midtones selected, or the midtones of this. And then I could go down and then add in just that little bit of clarity. Doesn't need to be a whole lot. And then maybe just as one last thing for this photograph, maybe I want to add a little bit more color to those clouds. This is a trick I've talked about before on this channel, but I think it is always helpful to use or to talk about again. If I create a new mask, we're going to select the sky, and then we're going to subtract a color range. We're going to subtract the blues out of the sky. So you can see here I have subtracted those blues, and then I can refine that further by taking away more and more blue, and then we could just add in color to those clouds. I can add it in with the color temperature slider, or I could even add a color effect like this and maybe add in something like so, and then look at that. Before, after. We have not affected those blues, and that gives us a much more natural amount of color in the photograph. So let's go ahead and see before and after with all of these masks here. Not a whole lot. Looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 masks. So not a whole lot, but we have really transformed this photograph from a very difficult shooting situation. A huge thank you for watching this week's video. I truly do appreciate it. If you would like to join me on a photography adventure like this one to Alaska, head over to my website, warnerwildernessphotography.com. There's a link down below. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you next time.